This is Richard Oberhammer in Raleigh, North Carolina, recording on March 4th, 2022. I'm responding to an interview which was conducted by Stephen Blackwood last month on February. It was posted on February 12th. An interview with Vernon Smith, the great economist who I think is credited with being the father of experimental economics. I listened to that interview very carefully, went through it, took pages of notes. And what I have, my response to the interview isn't a complaint at all about anything they say in a positive sense, but I notice what's missing. You see, because for much of my life, I've been developing a model, a way of thinking about social life, which includes economics, which it's a bigger picture. And it seems to me that the things Stephen Blackwood and Vernon Smith say in this interview show how they don't know my model. Of course, I couldn't expect them to know my model, but I use this response to point out the advantages that I think come from the model which I invite you to consider. Now, in a few sentences, I'll introduce the model. It has to do with life. It's a bigger picture. It's how does life survive in the universe? That's the question, which deserves attention. And I start with a few simple assumptions that life can survive only if it gathers resources like energy and raw materials from the larger environment. So life, any living system faces the challenge of gathering together what it needs to survive. And one of the important things that shows up in my model is that some of the resources that are available to us living things can be harvested from only if we cooperate. So there are circumstances during the course of our lives when if we want to live better, we need to find ways to cooperate. Now, in what follows, I will respond to snippets from the interview to show how my model would suggest different answers. And we start with this that Stephen Blackwood said right near the end of the interview. I can only conclude that there is a non-zero-sum character inherent to reality itself, which emerges out of the spontaneous ordering of these particular pieces. I'll respond to each of those two clauses. We start with the first. There is a non-zero-sum character inherent to reality itself. Well, in the reality that I put out in my model, resources already exist, like the fertile earth and the sun and Jupiter. These resources already exist. What is non-zero sum is the ability of us living things to harvest from those resources. So I think Stephen Blackwood is right, speaking as a human being about our experience as living things. Yes, we can do better as we learn how to behave better, but the larger picture of reality already contains the concentrations of energy and raw materials which are waiting there for us to discover how to exploit. Now we'll go on to the second clause. This non-zero sum character emerges out of the spontaneous ordering of these particular pieces. And I've highlighted the word spontaneous because I think when we say that something emerges spontaneously, what we mean is we really don't have a good idea of the details of how that process produced this thing that we notice. However, the model which I offer, which I invite you to consider, does get into the details of how living things organize to take advantage of the resources in the environment. And as we develop more detailed understanding of how these living things and their societies emerge, we wouldn't think of it as spontaneous. We will have a lot of detailed information about how these things, about how these orderings emerged. Now I will tell a little more about the model of life which I advance. I call it the resource patterns model of life because it emphasizes the resources which make life possible. Economic activity occurs in our human sphere, and we interact with the environment because our interaction with the environment can gain for us because the resources in the environment exist out there in patterns. If the resources weren't patterned, we couldn't behave intelligently. So I call attention to resource patterns, and at the same time, that brings up our behavior in response to resource patterns. We living things have to use whatever sensing and thinking capabilities we have to respond to the environment, to the resource patterns in the environment with behavior patterns. We use our information processing to decide how to behave in patterns which enable us to harvest from the resources. I've presented this model a handful of times in academic conferences, and I've got about 50 posts on a blog, which you can see. It's at perceivedorder.blogspot.com. If you want to jump in, or whenever you're ready to jump in to try to understand what I'm trying to show you. On that blog, I have posted draft chapters of a book that I am writing. There are 7 draft chapters there now. Now that resource patterns and behavior patterns are in our shared vocabulary, I want to point out something. Vernon Smith described a 2-person trust game at about minute 36 in the interview. And what happens in that game, he said, we found that pretty absolutely amazing, that the 2 people came to trust each other, even though the experiment was designed to create a circumstance in which the people we might expect them to find no reason to trust each other, or to try to find a cooperation. But the thing I noticed about that interview was that the pool doubled when the first player decided not to take the reward that was available. The pool immediately doubled. The amount that was available to both players doubled. So the 2 players together were in an environment in which what they both could take might double if they could discover a way of behaving together. So I would say we shouldn't be surprised at all that living things have instincts which guide them into circumstances where a larger group of them can do better. At about 71 minutes into the interview, Vernon Smith says, economic exchange begins with each side having something the other side wants. Certainly, I agree with that, but I call attention to the larger context. Economic exchange starts when agents in an environment can harvest more for the agents, for that interior little group, the two agents in a larger environment. If those two agents can get more from the larger environment by cooperating, that's where economic exchange starts. Economic exchange wouldn't start, for the most part, unless the environment offered rewards to agents who discovered behavior patterns enabling their own advance in their own circle. In the resource patterns model of life, we start with some postulates. And one of the postulates is there are some living things already there. They're surviving as hunter-gatherers, just barely living. And then another postulate we start with is there are resources which are not yet being exploited. Huge resources which promise a lot of wealth to living things if those living things can discover how to exploit the resources. Also, as we create these thought experiments, we start out with the assumption that some of these bounteous resources can only be harvested from if living things divide up the task, if living things develop specialties, and a group of individuals who each take on specialties can harvest, and that group, having thus found ways to specialize, can live much better than their neighbors or their forebears who are still living as hunter-gatherers. So the basic model, which I think is good to understand economic activity, is I suggest a trade route. I think the mainstream economics has gotten into this mindset of markets and market prices, and much of economics, I guess, I think of Ronald Coase discovering ways that the market models are just nonsensical. Like what Coase asked, why do people form firms? And Vernon Smith asks, why do these individual agents in an experiment move toward cooperation? Those are good questions to ask if we start out assuming that markets are, if our ontology is marketplaces. But if our starting point is a trade route in which individual agents only know their own environment, well, in mainstream economics, the market assumption is that all the agents have access to all the information. But in a trade route, each agent knows only itself and its immediate surroundings and its own living experiences. Now, that being said, because we are developing a model in which groups of agents which learn how to cooperate can live better, we shouldn't be surprised if evolution, assuming Darwinian sort of pressure on the instincts and abilities of living things, we shouldn't be surprised to see that we have built into us instincts to form groups. Since there are circumstances in the environment that we occupy in which groups which are already formed can do better than individuals, to some extent, we should expect people to have biases to form groups. And now I illustrate that once again by referring to something Vernon Smith says. In the two-person trust game, in which they tried to design that experiment so that members in the class were anonymous to each other, so that nobody could remember or know who their trading partners had been. Yet the results showed that members of the class did act, you might say, altruistically or pressed forward toward group gain. So I point out that the members of a class in a college setting, all the members of a class, they are a group, even though they haven't done anything together yet. They might. The future for them might hold many opportunities to make friends in the class and to advance forward in their lives, having known these classmates. So, given that groups can be so beneficial, don't be surprised that members of a class take on an ethic to help the whole class. Now I want to address a subject which Vernon Smith raises. It's about enforcing property rights. At one place, he mentions ostracism, where the ostracized person may feel just terrible about being ostracized by a group. And at another point, he goes on to talk about some way of enforcing property rights, perhaps using third parties. But in the model of economics, which grows out of the resource patterns model of life, there is considerable gain to individual agents in trade. And so by simply refusing to trade with someone, that one that you are refusing to trade with may lose. So that can be enforced with two parties, with you perhaps refusing to trade with me, and thereby denying me the gain that I would have if we entered that reciprocally advantageous trade. Well, a system of property rights might assume a zero-sum environment in which, if I need to come after you for taking my stuff is gone until I get it back. But in the resource patterns model of life, the agents are always facing opportunities to undertake productive work. So that creates an environment in which it's to my advantage to experiment in trading with you. I'll try just a little bit. If I lose it, I lose it. But if I have a successful little trade with you, then I can move on to try bigger trades with you. And this process of gaining trust with trading partners takes place without any third-party enforcement. I'm not saying the third-party enforcement won't grow, but it's important to point out that the environment which we assume, in which there are gains to be made by trading, that environment itself creates incentives to cooperate and disincentives to not cooperate. Well, thank you for your attention. I hope this has given you an idea of what I am doing with the resource patterns model of life. And I invite you to search it out further. You can see more at perceivedorder.blogspot.com. And I have a personal homepage at richard-o-hammer.org.